Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ron Klein, and I'm chairman of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, or JDCA. JDCA is an organization that was formed to help elect Democrats who support the State of Israel, as well as our Jewish community values and interests at home, including access to health care and women's reproductive rights, gun law reform, protection of the environment, fight for separation of church and state, and fight against a serious rise in anti-Semitism. In 2018, JDCA was very successful when we endorsed and supported 58 competitive House and Senate candidates who supported our cause and helped elect 84% of them. We're going to be continuing to expand that effort in the 2020 election in the House, Senate, and presidential race. Look us up and support us at www.jewishdem's.org. I'm here today with our special guest, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel Dan Shapiro, Tamara Cofman Wittes, and Ilan Goldenberg, whom we'll introduce shortly. With the 2020 election less than 10 months away, we're unfortunately already seeing many attempts to misrepresent where Democrats stand on Israel, which President Trump has unfortunately repeatedly tried to use as a wedge issue. We at the Jewish Democratic Council of America are strongly supportive of the U.S.-Israel relationship, Israel's security, and Israel's right to self-defense. We have no illusions about the difficulty of achieving a negotiated two-state solution and understand that there are no shortcuts to peace. It's with this in mind that we were anxious to see and fully review President Trump's plan for peace, which he released earlier this week. We are concerned that the crucial role of the U.S. as an impartial arbiter in the peace process is compromised when the president announces the plan and only one side is present. This is not the art of negotiation. You either have both sides present at the announcement or neither side present and show your leadership by openly and transparently indicating that you will be inviting both parties to the table for negotiations. We view the U.S. role as facilitator of the peace process as crucial and do not want a lack of credibility or trustworthiness to result in our country's central role being replaced by Russia, China, or other countries. We at JDCA aim to dispel false narratives with facts and get experts who have long worked on Middle East policy to give us their views on the proposal and the prospect for its success. That is why we have convened this call today. I will now turn it over to JDCA's Vice Chair, Barbara Goldberg-Goldman, to introduce our esteemed speakers.
Thank you so much, Ron, and thank you, Haley Soifer, our Executive Director, for putting this call together so quickly. I'm delighted to introduce this powerhouse panel of experts and very good friends of JDCA. Our first speaker is Ambassador Dan Shapiro, who is currently serving as the Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Tel Aviv University's Institute of National Studies. Previously, Dan served as the United States Ambassador to Israel from 2011 to 2017. Our second speaker is Tamara Cofman Wittes, Senior Fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings, who previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Last but certainly not least is Ilan Goldenberg, Senior Fellow and Director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Ilan previously served as Chief of Staff to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in the Obama administration. I think you'll agree that few individuals are more qualified than Dan, Tamara, and Ilan to offer insights on recent developments related to Israel and the Middle East, and we are most grateful that they're joining us today to help us analyze and understand the President's plan. By the way, as a reminder to those joining us, all the lines are muted, but please send your questions to us, info@jewishdem's.org. That's info@jewishdem's.org, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. Following the presentations, our Executive Director, Haley Soifer, will moderate questions. We'll start with you, Dan.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Haley, and it's good to be with Tamara and Ilan, and welcome everybody to the call. I'll just start by saying that all of us have participated in various diplomatic initiatives, including Israeli-Palestinian initiatives during our time in government and as advisors maybe from outside government. And no one has succeeded at this. So obviously a certain amount of humility is called for in evaluating it. And, I've tried to be very, very respectful and appreciative that the president made this a priority early on. And even though, he appointed people who hadn't worked on it before, that, let's give it a chance and see what they produce before we judge it. So I've really been, I think it's important that we do that. Obviously, you have to worry that a plan that is presented that doesn't work can lead to some very severe ramifications, and that could actually set back prospects for other attempts to end the conflict. And I think that may be the situation we're finding ourselves in. And I was in government. I sometimes joke that the experience of trying to negotiate with Israelis and Palestinians could be summarized in one sentence. Every meeting with either side basically amounted to them saying to us, if you, the United States, would just adopt our positions as your own and impose them on the other side, everything would be just fine. And that didn't ever seem to me to be the way an effective mediator can actually conduct themselves. You have to have the trust of both sides. You have to be able to talk to both sides. And unfortunately, for the last over 2 years, there's been zero diplomatic contact between the Trump administration and the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinians maybe can bear some of the responsibility and the blame for that. They boycotted the Trump administration after the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but also perhaps had reason to think that the Trump administration didn't really give serious weight to their legitimate aspirations. But that's basically then what happened is we had negotiations with only one side, and I think we're now testing that theory. What happens when you only talk to one side? And what happens is that you get a plan that is almost certainly unimplementable because it will be so difficult for any Palestinian leader to deal with or to be able to present it as any kind of reasonable achievement of Palestinian national aspirations to their people, that they simply won't participate. They weren't there at the beginning. They weren't there at the end. There's no reason to expect that they will be participants in trying to implement it. And that will lead Israel down the path toward perhaps very quickly toward unilateral measures, perhaps to include annexation. Just briefly to highlight a couple of ways this is a sharp departure from past negotiations. A colleague and friend and mentor of all of ours, Martin Indyk, who has worked this issue for decades and knows the history intimately. He said when he read the plan, what he observed, really knowing the previous negotiations almost word by word, was that anywhere previous negotiations had produced agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, they adopted that and put it into the text. And anywhere there was bracketed text with an Israeli position and a Palestinian position that was unresolved, they just simply took the Israeli position and put it into their plan. And so they ended up with something that, in one sense, they broke ground on by using the name two-state solution, but it's really two states in name only. On almost every major issue, it breaks very heavily for Israel, which on the one hand, if you're a supporter of Israel, you could say, well, that's nice to see Israel's concerns being taken into account. But if it produces a situation where the other side can't even engage, much less agree, then it doesn't lead anywhere. So on territory, it envisions something on the order of 70% of the West Bank in non-contiguous chunks with Israeli settlements with Israeli sovereignty attached to them, embedded inside, protected by the IDF. This is a far cry from what most previous negotiations have envisioned, of something on the order of 90+% of the West Bank with some land swaps, but making the areas contiguous and certainly perhaps with some special arrangements for settlements that may be behind them, but not as sort of sovereign Israeli territory protected by the IDF. The security provisions definitely give a very sort of present Israeli aspect. As Ilan knows and has published on, John Allen worked during the Kerry talks to come up with very creative professional military solutions to security challenges that would give Palestinian space and some modicum of sovereignty and dignity, while still allowing all of Israel's legitimate security needs to be met. On Jerusalem, it describes the whole city as Israel's undivided capital, Palestinians gaining access to a couple of outer neighborhoods beyond the separation barrier. but previous negotiations have envisioned a meaningful Palestinian presence in Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. The one formula was what is Arab will be Palestinian, what is Jewish will be Israeli. A shared city where two capitals can more or less coexist. This plan says, it actually contradicts itself. It says, as to the holy sites, that there will be no change of status quo at the holy sites, and then it also says all religions will be able to pray at the Temple Mount. Well, that is not the status quo. The status quo is that only Muslims pray at the Temple Mount. So that is a change. And on refugees, I think as most plans have envisioned, there's no serious prospect of a right of return of Palestinians to Israel, but this one also makes clear there's no serious prospect of any meaningful immigration of Palestinian refugees to the established state of Palestine, and no compensation mechanism or other means set up to deal with the Palestinian refugees and their descendants who have had a very hard existence for decades. So there are those who are saying, well, the map and the Trump plan looks a lot like the map or the map people discern from the stage that Oslo was at when Rabin was assassinated. I think that's a lot of conjecture based on an Oslo process that was still in its early phase, and on the assumption that Rabin would have remained static through the rest of his life and the rest of that process had he lived. So I don't think that's a very meaningful comparison. But in many, many ways, this is a far cry from past negotiations where both sides were fully engaged. Now, it's been received reasonably positively in Israel, obviously. Many Israelis who don't follow a lot of these things in as much detail as some of us do feel that it was obviously attentive to Israel's needs. There is a lot of disbelief that the two-state solution was possible anyway, and so that maybe it's better to just ignore the downsides, take the good news of what Israel got, and kind of take a little satisfaction in Palestinians who, after all, have boycotted negotiations for many years, sort of got what they deserved, which was an even lessened package for doing so. There are a smaller number of true believers in the two-state solution who are feeling a lot of despair, like we could be approaching really the end of the era of achieving that. Prime Minister Netanyahu, as you all heard during his remarks at the White House, raved about it being a historic agreement. Benny Gantz has also been quite positive about it and trying not to appear to be less enthusiastic about it than Prime Minister Netanyahu. Gantz has his eye on trying to win the support of maybe one or two Knesset seats worth of soft right-wing voters who have voted for Likud, but he thinks might move over to blue and white. So that's his main target in this upcoming election on March 2nd. So there's a reason why he's trying to minimize any sense of a gap between him and Netanyahu. He, of course, had this somewhat unexpected invitation to go to the White House, and he had to kind of handle that delicately. Didn't want to be disrespectful to Trump, although I think considered not going, certainly not going in a situation where he'd be sitting in the room with Trump and Netanyahu and sort of looking like the third wheel. I think he handled it fairly elegantly. He projected back to the Israeli people that he's sort of prime minister material, could have a handle a meeting in the Oval Office. He certainly avoided any ire from Trump for not coming and Trump tweets. But he's also, even in his positive remarks about the plan, he's been careful, and it's a bit caveated. He says he looks forward to implementing it, but only after a new government is formed. So that pushes it several months down the road, and he, of course, means that when he hopes to form the next government. He says he wants it to be part of an international consensus. Well, that's interesting because that means Arab states and European states would have their views taken into account. He specifies the importance of the relationship with Jordan, and we know that this plan is quite sensitive to Jordan, the idea of something that really does not look like a two-state solution or unilateral annexation of the Jordan Valley, very, very sensitive. And he has even said it should be done in agreement with the Palestinians. Well, all of those elements, international consensus, caring about Jordan, agreement with the Palestinians, suggest that he's not running toward unilateral measures like wide-scale annexation. So that's something worth keeping an eye on, and I think he is keeping an eye on the fact that the Trump administration may have a short shelf life itself, and that it's possible that there will be a different administration a year from now. Even without knowing that, he is attentive, I think, to the need to have good relationships with Democrats, and so I think she's trying to sort of be careful and delicate in how he manages this. Just a moment or two more. The Prime Minister, of course, has been on kind of a victory lap about it, but it's a bit complicated for him. There are critics in his camp, among settlers, among the right in his party, and in the Naftali Bennett Yamina party, of the fact that this establishes a Palestinian state, even if it's kind of a semi-state, and even if it's only on 70%, if it's barely functional. But nevertheless, they oppose any use of the term Palestinian state or that concept. Netanyahu did not mention those words in his speech, but there are some who are very opposed to that. They think Israel should annex the entire West Bank. That is, I think, why the Prime Minister and his office indicated they were going to move very, very quickly, as early as next week, to begin the annexation process of settlements of the West Bank, of the blocks of Jordan Valley. Wasn't clear exactly how much. Haaretz is reporting that was somewhat encouraged on them by Ambassador Friedman, but sort of shot down by Jared Kushner. I can't, verify that, but that's what's being reported. Kushner, of course, has the responsibility to try to generate support for this plan among Arab states who have been polite but tepid about it so far, and he probably thinks he needs more time to deal with them and to deal with a strong Jordanian reaction. So it appears now that they're not going to move annexation legislation next week. Kushner even said this is something that should probably wait until after a new government has been established, so that's several months. They've talked of creating a committee between the White House and the Israeli government to designate exactly what the areas are. Now the Prime Minister's office is citing technical delays in not bringing that legislation to vote next week. I'm not sure the Prime Minister is so concerned about the views of Democrats, but he has to be concerned about the views of Jared Kushner. So next week could be somewhat tricky for him. For one thing, he's not going to be moving this annexation legislation, but Benny Gantz announced at the INSS conference I was spending the last 2 days at in his speech there yesterday a rather tricky maneuver. He intends to try to bring to a vote in the Knesset next week a non-binding resolution called like a sense of Congress resolution that endorses the Trump plan in its entirety, maybe even the text of the plan. And he believes that will be actually very difficult for Netanyahu and his camp to vote for, precisely because it mentions a Palestinian state and it mentions a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, albeit just a sliver of outer neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. Both of those are very hard things for right-leaning members of Knesset to vote for. So that could be a tricky thing next week. Lastly, how's this affecting the polls? Maybe the most important question. It's too early. Tomorrow morning, Friday morning, is when the major polls will be published for the week. But one was published tonight, and not that surprising, absolutely no change. After 2 or 3 days of wall-to-wall coverage of both leaders in Washington and the announcement of the plan and all of its elements and how good it was and how good it's being described for Israel, virtually no change in any polling. 35 for seats for Blue and White, 33 for Likud, about 13 for the joint list, the Joint Arab Party list, and about the regular 7 or 8 for all the smaller parties. Interestingly, there doesn't appear to really have moved very much. There are a couple things to watch. One is the fact that the plan contained a provision that would possibly lead to the redrawing of Israel's boundary to draw out of Israel several towns of Arab towns and villages in the Galilee and attach them to the Palestinian state. That is very much opposed by Arab residents of Israel. It may become a driver of turnout in the Arab sector of Israel, which actually could lead to a larger number of seats for the joint list, something to watch. The Prime Minister's trial formally got underway on Tuesday, the same day he was at the White House. He withdrew his request for immunity from the Knesset. So the trial, which is called the State of Israel versus Benjamin Netanyahu, is underway. It'll be mostly preliminary motions. He won't appear in court before the election, but there will be news dripping out about it every day, and the headlines of the deal of the century will fade a bit, and he may have to try to generate some new headlines. He, of course, stopped in Moscow on the way home with good news of securing the release of an Israeli woman, Naama Yisachar, who had been imprisoned on a very harsh sentence for a small drug charge in Moscow. So he is that. But it seems from the polling and just to talking to people that attitudes are very, very set people who were prepared to vote for Netanyahu despite corruption charges are still prepared and see the deal of the century as validation of his skill. People who felt he must go are not really moved by what was achieved and think Gantz could secure it anyway. Already people are talking about a fourth election as a serious possibility, and it is a serious possibility. Victor Lieberman, who may hold the balances, again, also was at INSS conference today, and he said, no, that won't happen. Obviously, he can help determine whether or not it happens, but his criteria, as he calls it, for a national liberal government don't include him sitting with ultra-Orthodox parties, probably not the right-wing settler party, or in a government supported by the Joint Arab List. So the same dilemmas that prevented formation of a government last time could well be in place after the March 2nd election. I will stop there.
Well, Dan, thank you very much. And for those who do not know, Dan is on the ground in Israel, and it's very late there, so we do appreciate your taking the time to join us. And next we'll hear from Tamara, and I know it's going to be equally as informative. Tamara.
Thank you so much. Dan gave an excellent overview of the substance of the plan, so I just want to make a couple of points about dimensions of the Trump proposals that are particularly relevant for Palestinian and wider Arab and Muslim perceptions of the plan, and talk about the way and which direction things might go there. So the first thing, Dan talked about the substance of the plan. I want to focus you for a moment on the structure, because the plan was presented by the president as a basis for negotiations, but it's not structured that way. It's structured as an ultimatum. Why do I say that? Because what the president proposed, what the president announced, is that Israel will be able to annex territory allocated to it in the Trump map and get American recognition of that annexation at any time, whereas Palestinian statehood is conditioned on a long list of conditions, and Palestinians can agree or disagree with the map, but Israel can annex what the map says it can have. And what that means is that there's actually very little left to negotiate, given the detail in the plan itself and given that structure. It is in effect, and certainly from the perspective of the Palestinians who had no role in shaping it, it is in effect an imposed outcome. The conditions laid out in the plan for U.S. recognition of Palestinian statehood are formidable. Some would say they're inconceivable. Conditions like the Palestinian Authority or some other Palestinian government acceptable to Israel, taking control of the Gaza Strip, disarming Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and then the constraints on the Palestinian state in this plan are formidable. So the territory allocated to the thing this plan calls a Palestinian state is essentially 6 distinct cantons within the West Bank, the Gaza Strip with some blotches along the Sinai border connected by little tiny strips to Gaza, and 54 individual Palestinian towns that are given to be part of the Palestinian state but are surrounded on the map entirely by what will become sovereign Israeli territory. So when you hear people say that from a Palestinian perspective, this state looks like Swiss cheese and the Palestinians get the holes, you have 54 little holes that are Palestinian towns surrounded by sovereign Israeli territory in this plan. And how are all these bits of discontiguous Palestinian territory connected? They're connected, the plan says, by a series of roads that Israel will have full control over movement on those roads, and therefore Israel will have full control over the movement of Palestinians from one part of their state to another part of their state. In other words, from the Palestinian perspective, this plan looks effectively like it's codifying the existing relationship between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground. Israelis have control over territory, over resources, over Palestinian movement. They can shut Palestinians in their towns across the West Bank with, one checkpoint in 10 minutes. They can close down Palestinian movement in and out of any town or village in the West Bank. That's true today. That will be true if this plan is implemented. So you can call that a Palestinian state if you want to, but it doesn't have basic features of sovereignty, of self-determination, of viability as an economy or as a political entity. So that's why you see so much cynicism and from the Palestinian side. They're saying, look, all you're doing is codifying the occupation that we already live under. Now, I heard what Dan had to say about how far and how fast Netanyahu might try to push on annexation. What I want to emphasize to you is that I think it matters even to him. It matters what the signals and statements are from the Arab region and from the international community, from the Europeans, the Russians, and others. When the plan was unveiled, most of those governments were very careful to avoid offending Donald Trump. Their remarks were measured. They welcomed the administration's efforts. They didn't comment on the substance of the plan at all, and they expressed a hope for renewed direct Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. But that's not the end of the story by any means. The Arab League is gathering in Cairo tomorrow night and Saturday. They will issue a statement on behalf of all 22 members of the Arab League. I know I'm quite confident Mahmoud Abbas and King Abdullah of Jordan will be there making a strong case that an Arab League statement should warn explicitly against Israeli unilateral measures, and they will probably win that particular battle in this statement. The Gulf Arabs and others in the region, I think, were particularly surprised by the map. They had gotten briefed on some elements of the plan by Jared Kushner in the White House, but they hadn't seen the map. And looking at that Swiss cheese was dismaying, is my understanding, and also what the plan had to say about Jerusalem and this notion that the status quo and the Temple Mount might be subject to change. That's also an arena of significant concern, particularly for Saudi Arabia. So I think that what we'll see in the coming days and weeks is expressions of greater and greater concern in the Arab world about Jerusalem, about annexation, and also about Palestinian refugees. The fact that not even a symbolic number of Palestinian refugees under family reunification would be allowed into Israel, that had been an element in every previous final status proposal, and it was entirely missing from this. So I think the refugee issue is going to be one that will cause a lot of heartache in the Arab world as well. Finally, I just want to make a comment about what we're hearing now from the Trump administration and how it may shape reaction both here in the U.S. and out in the region. Dan mentioned this gap that's opened between Ambassador Friedman and Jared Kushner on the question of when the U.S. would favor Israeli annexation of territory in the West Bank. And I think that this is a gap that's always been there between these two gentlemen, and it's a gap that has sometimes led to delays in their progress, their work on this plan. But somehow this is going to have to get resolved. And if I had to put down money, I would say that that in every previous such clash between David Friedman and Jared Kushner, David Friedman has ultimately prevailed. So I would like to be as optimistic as Dan, but I worry about the incentives for Netanyahu to present Benny Gantz, to present the American administration, to present the world with some kind of fait accompli with respect to annexation. The incentives are very strong. I also want to note that some of this sort of victory lap that you're seeing from the Trump administration, some of the condescending comments from Jared Kushner that you saw in his interview with Christiana Mampour, stuff like that, part of it is that they always kind of do this victory lap when they roll out major policy pronouncements. They kind of can't help it. But I think part of what they're doing here is they are trying to provoke a bit of a reaction from people in the U.S. Who they view as their political adversaries. They love the polarization on this issue in the United States, and they would be happy to see that exacerbated in the wake of this rollout. And I think they, wouldn't mind provoking a very harsh rhetoric as well from the Palestinian leadership, even though I think that there are those in the Gulf and elsewhere who are trying to encourage the Palestinian leadership to engage. But practically speaking, and this is what I'll leave you with, if the Palestinian leadership were to engage with this proposal and say that it's a basis for negotiations, that would be a tactical move. That would be a move designed simply to try and deter or delay Israeli annexation. It would not be done on the Palestinians' part or on the part of the Gulf Arabs who are encouraging them to do this. It would not be done with any hope that the Palestinians could sit down at the table with the Israelis and get something more than what is written in this plan. The plan in its substance and its structure is an ultimatum. It is a dictated outcome. Now, the Israelis are happy to accept this particular dictated outcome because it's beneficial to their interests. It leans in their direction. But as I wrote a piece in the foreword that was published yesterday, I think that accepting an American dictate, which is something no Israeli government has previously been willing to do on this issue, carries risks for Israel as well. So happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if you like, but with that, I will pass it on to Ilan.
Tamara, thank you so much for that analysis and the insight that you're providing. I know there'll be questions. Ilan, you're next.
Sure. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And I'll try to keep my remarks relatively short because there's not a lot more to say after what Dan and Tammy have already gone through. I'll just start with the fact that the plan itself, for all the reasons that have already been outlined, really is not what matters. The plan in many ways is dead on arrival. What really matters is whether it leads to a decision by Israel to annex the pieces, basically annex all of the Israeli settlements and the Jordan River Valley and the potential implications of that. I think that's the much more important part of the long-term implications we should be focusing on. So I'll spend a minute or two on the plan and just adding a couple of comments to what Tammy and Dan already said, and then I'll get into more of these questions about annexation and where things go next. In terms of the plan itself, I want to, just on Jerusalem, just to say one thing, even to expand beyond what's already been said. Israel, captured Jerusalem in 1967, or at least, East Jerusalem, the old city. It then redefined what Jerusalem boundaries actually were. So the Palestinians don't even believe that what they got as Jerusalem in this plan is actually at all any part of Jerusalem. It'd be a bit like, I have New York. I'm going to redefine New York to also include Hoboken and Jersey City. Now I'm going to give you Hoboken and Jersey City to be your capital while I keep all of New York. I mean, that's kind of how I think the Palestinians are viewing it. And then just to talk a little bit more about security in particular in the Jordan River Valley, because I spent a lot of time working on that, and as Dan mentioned, we did a long report on that at CNAS. Look, the issue with the Jordan River Valley and whether Israel needs it for its long-term security. There was a time when Israel did need the Jordan River Valley. The Jordan River Valley was to defend against a conventional invasion, basically tanks coming from the east, from Saudi Arabia or Iraq, through Jordan and into Israel. So you needed the high ground in the Jordan River Valley to be able to prevent against that kind of an invasion. That's not really a viable option anymore. If tanks were ever to start coming into Jordan towards Israel, the Israeli Air Force would destroy those before they ever even got into the Jordan River Valley. What really matters for Israel's security these days is terrorism, the possibility that that border can be used for smuggling weapons, sort of like weapons that have gone into Gaza from Egypt and things like that. But that's a different set of arrangements that you can conduct right along the border while allowing the Palestinians to have that huge area of the Jordan River Valley, which is key for their economy and for their agriculture. And we spent a long time in the Obama administration developing ideas for how to do that. And believe it or not, Israelis were kind of bought off on that at the time, including, their big question was on security was, what do you do about internal security inside the Palestinian towns? But even the Israeli leadership kind of acknowledged that John Allen had found a solution that for the most part worked for the Jordan River Valley. So those are just a couple of things on the plan. I'll also just say that reading the plan, as a negotiator and somebody who, so much of this conflict is about language and history and being sensitive in your language to both sides and reflecting the values, the views, there's certain trigger words, and just reading it, it's written clearly by someone who's never talked to a Palestinian about it, which is actually what's basically happened here. It really just reads like, absolute tin ear on basic just way you describe simple things for Palestinians that sound so condescending and infuriating. And you can never even get to the substance with a Palestinian on a plan like this because they'll just be so angry reading some of the words. And so that was kind of my reaction to the plan. But let's talk about the more important piece here, and that is sort of annexation and what the United States can do, which is I think what Haley really wanted me to get into. As Dan and Tammy have already said, the real question is, okay, what if Israel actually begins applying Israeli law and annexing all this territory, which could happen probably not next week, but, sometime before November of 2020, potentially. And if it does, that puts the United States in a really, really tough position. And I think there's a few things the next administration might do, or Democrats can even do right now, to try and sort of head that off. One is, which I think is important now, and pretty much I think all the Democratic candidates for president have been very clear that they're going to oppose annexation, and they should be making that clear and also making clear that they will reverse any policies that support annexation. I think it's also been good to see, Democrats across the spectrum in the House and in the Senate coming out very clearly against this in different ways, but, ranging from those who are more comfortable being critical to those who have a stronger relationship with Israel and less comfortable, but still all making clear that, the importance here is, a negotiated agreement and also that annexation needs to be off the table. If annexation does happen and a new administration comes in, I'm not exactly sure how you can reverse it. You would probably start by at least making clear that you don't recognize it on day one and reversing that policy by the Trump administration. I think probably a new Democratic administration now, we've been hesitant to do things like put down maps and put down our own visions of solutions, but unless somebody puts down an alternative to what has now been put down, it kind of becomes, at this level of detail, it becomes the opening argument. So you might see a Democratic administration with no choice but to, go through the exercise the Trump administration went through and actually put it all out there. And it'll frankly be an answer that's much less appealing to the Israelis, but is meant to actually, create those brackets Dan talked about and actually look for a negotiation between the two sides. So I can see a Democratic administration having to do that. I mean, I think administration will certainly try to repair relationships with the Palestinians early on by doing things like reopening a Palestinian mission in Washington if that's possible. It might not be possible given current laws. Certainly reopening an American consulate, probably in East Jerusalem, and also making clear as part of that that the U.S.'s position is for two capitals in Jerusalem. I think, and restarting aid to the Palestinians, just trying to rebuild the relationship. But I do think if annexation happens, and I think I want to just close with this, If annexation happens, we need to think long and hard about the implications for the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship. I don't believe that the U.S. is going to walk away from Israel, nor do I believe the U.S. should walk away from Israel, right? But ultimately, we're going to have a choice then. We're going to have to choose between a policy of supporting democracy and human rights, which means supporting a binational state with equal rights for all its citizens, or supporting a state where that doesn't happen, which starts to look, increasingly like an undemocratic state, where Jews are one layer of one kind of citizen and Palestinians are not citizens. And I just wonder if 10 or 20 years from now, where will the Democratic Party be on this? I don't know. I think it's more likely to be on the side of democracy and human rights. And that doesn't end the relationship. We have had relationships with, we have relationships with countries all over the world. Where we don't necessarily agree on everything, including the nature of their democracies and their governing system. But it really could change sort of undercut the notion of common values in the U.S.-Israel relationship and leave us with security interests and economic interests. But that's different. That's not the kind of relationship we've historically had. It's not the relationship I want between the U.S. and Israel. But I fear that is the long-term implication of this if the Netanyahu government goes through with annexation, and if it is irreversible and there's no opportunity for a two-state solution. And that's, I think, a pretty devastating outcome for all of us that I don't think any of us want. But I really think we need to think about it in this terms. I really believe it is that grave a threat to the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship. So I'll stop there.
Dan, thank you so much, Ilan, for sharing your crystal ball with us. So thank you to Tamara, Dan, and Ilan. And now I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Haley Soifer, who will ask some questions that have been sent to her through the email. Haley.
Great. Our first question relates to the discrepancy between the two-page summary put out by the White House of the plan and then the 180-page plan plus the maps that many of you referred to. One of those items that was not clearly delineated in the two-page summary related to parts of the plan that propose the transfer of Arab towns inside of Israel to a future Palestinian state. Could you speak, whoever would like to take this one, perhaps all of you, about how we should view this issue, particularly through the lens of Jewish values, and what that means in terms of those Israeli citizens losing their citizenship and how they view it?
Hi, this is Tamara. Let me start, and then I imagine my colleagues will want to jump in. To me, this was the most jaw-dropping component of the Trump proposal. The map was unclear, and we couldn't quite tell until Don Rotem and then David McCoskey got information from the White House and used more sophisticated geographic mapping systems to check this out. But the White House map, as well as the text of the plan, lay out that about a half a dozen Arab towns and villages that are part of Israel, that's about 260,000 Arab citizens of Israel that live in cities like el-Fahim or Baqa al-Gharbia in the Galilee, that those towns and the people who live in them will become part of the Palestinian state to be. The language of the plan says that this is contemplated with agreement of the parties, that is the Israeli government and the Palestinian government. There is nothing in the plan about whether those Arab residents in those towns get any say. Now, you might assume that of course they would get a say, but in the Jerusalem section of the plan, it says explicitly that residents of Jerusalem who are now Palestinian residents of Jerusalem can choose as individuals whether to become Israeli citizens, remain Jerusalem residents, or become citizens of Palestine. So the contrast there makes it clear that the Arab citizens in the Galilee don't get a choice about getting transferred out of Israel. Now, these residents, this is about 14% of Israel's Arab population. And Dan mentioned earlier just what a strong presence the Joint Arab List has become in the Israeli Knesset. It may well be the third largest party coming out of these elections. And so this is essentially an effort to take away 15% of that electorate out of the Israeli citizenry and reduce the quote-unquote demographic problem, as some Israelis like to describe it. It is also, and I'm going to be really blunt about this, it is an American government endorsing ethnic cleansing. In my life, and I started doing foreign policy, working on the genocide in Bosnia, in my life, I never thought I would see an American government endorsing ethnic cleansing, and that's what this plan does.
This is Dan. I'll just add one note to Tamara's very thorough explanation of it. This is a proposal that was included in the plan specifically to appeal to Avigdor Lieberman. He has at various times proposed something very similar to this, that there are Arab towns near the border, the old former Green Line, that he would be happy to cede to a Palestinian state in the two-state solution. He is the linchpin in the formation of the government, has been in the last two government formations, and could very well be again in the government formation process following the upcoming election. So it seems very clear that this provision was included to appeal to him, possibly in hopes of helping avoid a government stalemate in a few weeks' time.
And this is Ilan. The only thing I'll add to, I won't even add anything on the issue, but just to say, Haley, you referenced that two-page document. I would just take that two-page document and throw it in the garbage, because it really, they rolled it out first. It has no relation to the 180-page plan they put out afterwards. And people who initially read the two-pager thought, this isn't so bad, and then saw the 180 pages that came afterwards that kind of had all the jaw-dropping important things that weren't in the two-pager.
Great. Our next question comes from Susie Gelman. How concerned are you that the Trump plan moves the goalpost on future efforts by a Democratic administration to meaningfully engage in peacemaking between Israelis and Palestinians? And assuming that annexation does not take place before November, is it possible to go back to square one, or will future Democratic administrations be constrained by the terms of this plan?
So I can hop in on that one for a second. I mean, I am somewhat concerned. It kind of depends. If annexation happens, and also if Trump is reelected, I think that this does, if Trump is reelected, then I think annexation does happen over the next 4 or 5 years for sure. And then we really are constrained in an entirely new world. If annexation does not happen, I think what you have done with this, the fact that like Benny Gantz and essentially the center of Israel has kind of endorsed this plan, it moves the goalposts in Israel on what is expected in any final agreement, which is going to make it all that much harder to negotiate something. So I think there's a huge challenge. And the other major challenge, I would argue, is a Democratic administration cannot come in now and say, we have 4 or 5 theoretical parameters that we want to use as the basis for this. Something like the Clinton parameters doesn't make sense as much anymore, because I think it can be very easily countered from the right with something that is much more specific and much more extensive in the form of this document. And so I kind of believe that most likely if a Democratic administration wants to seriously engage in this process, it may have to do the work of putting out something similar but alternative, essentially negotiating with our own within our own system on what we think is a sort of viable proposal. But if I was going to do something like this, for example, what I would do differently, in addition to changing a bunch of the language, is in some place what I would have done if I were them would be to lay out the details, and then in a few different areas keep those brackets, keep options, and sort of say, this is the rough ballpark that we're talking about in the United States. here are the different choices on what you could do on Jerusalem. Here are the different choices on what you can do on security. Here are some options on territory. Like that's one way to potentially do it, or try and do it all yourself and put out a choice. But this all goes back to the point Tammy was making earlier that, in the past, the argument has been administrations the United States should not be doing this. The United States should not be putting down its own proposal because it shouldn't be dictating the terms. But I think that's got to be out the window for every administration going forward. I just don't think there's any going back on something like this. But maybe Tammy or Dan disagree with me on this. And I'm still thinking about it, only a day or two after it happened. I think we're all still digesting, like, what are the long-term results and ramifications of all this for American policy.
Well, I'll just add that the last point that Ilan made really has resonated with me, that the long-standing principle that U.S. and Israel basically agreed on in these processes was that the United States, or no outside party, should try to impose terms on the actual parties, and that no agreements could be reached other than those reached through direct negotiations between the two parties, and that both sides should avoid the unilateral steps that could harm the atmosphere of negotiations or even the content of what's being negotiated. It wasn't always observed clearly, but those were three basic principles that we kind of observed and agreed on, and clearly those have all been breached in this proposal. It's a clear externally imposed solution. It's, as Tammy said, described as a basis of negotiations, but it's really an ultimatum. So it's an imposition, and it's from an outside actor. It's not the result of direct negotiations, or not even indirect negotiations, since we hadn't been speaking with the Palestinians. It contemplates this very aggressive unilateral action by Israel on annexation, either within the plan or if the plan does not proceed, maybe at the very beginning of the plan. Sorry, last point on that is that the Israelis are very kind of happy about it, but the loss of those principles, it's certainly possible to imagine scenarios where it wouldn't work out as well to their advantage now that those principles don't seem to be principles anymore.
Great, and our last question comes from Michael Rosenzweig in Atlanta, and this touches on something that you really got into a bit, Ilan, but I'm hoping all three of you can comment on it. The conventional wisdom for decades has been that Israel cannot remain Jewish and democratic if it annexes Israeli settlements in the West Bank, given demographic realities. If this plan is implemented as designed, and particularly if Israel goes ahead and annexes 30% of the West Bank, what does the end result look like in terms of Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state?
So this is Tamara. Let me kick it off, and I'm sure my colleagues will chime in. Look, you can imagine this plan being implemented. The formal sovereign territory of Israel will include all of the 120-odd settlements designated on the Trump map and land around them. The sovereign territory of Israel will not include the areas where Palestinians live in the West Bank. And so, if you want to, at a formal level, say, well, who is a citizen of Israel and do the demographic breakdown, then you still have a significant minority of Arab citizens of Israel, but you have a strong Jewish majority of citizens of Israel. So at a formal level, you can say that's great. At a practical level, though, this quote-unquote solution doesn't actually solve the problem that Israel has faced since 1967, which is its what it understands as the necessity of controlling Palestinian lives and territory where Palestinians live in the West Bank and Gaza. In fact, in some ways, the map that the Trump administration put out goes a little bit backward compared to the present situation. Israel, for example, withdrew completely from the Gaza Strip back in 2005. This map would actually remove a little slice around the Gaza Strip and give it to Israel. And that would undermine, any international recognition of Israel's complete withdrawal from Gaza. But the bottom line is that Israel would remain responsible for Palestinian movement within the Palestinian state. As I said, you're talking about 60-plus distinct territorial units that are part of the Palestinian state just in the West Bank. Israel would be responsible for all of that. Israel would be responsible for movement of Palestinians in and out of their state. Israel would be responsible for all of the Palestinian states importing and exporting. So it's not actually different as a practical matter on the ground from the situation that exists today. It relieves Israel of none of those burdens of occupation, which is a phrase that I know Palestinians would object to, but it's certainly one that Israelis feel. It leaves Israel with all of those burdens, but you can call it a state instead of calling it occupation.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add that. I'm actually even more negative, I think, than Tammy on this possibly, because at some point, right? Look, the reason we have the West Bank is under occupation, so that under international law, it is not part of Israel, and that's kind of how you call it a democracy, right? But but the whole point of international occupation is it's supposed to be temporary. If you move to a point where you're essentially ensconcing a permanent occupation, you have to question whether or not, the term occupation still applies, or whether now you really do have second-class citizens and first-class citizens. And it doesn't matter so much if, in my mind, if it's 45% or 55% or 30% who are Palestinian or 80% who are Palestinian. It's still a huge portion of your population who's not getting a vote, who's not getting the same rights, who can't travel. And I believe that in the scenarios we're playing out here, eventually, and you hear this already from a lot of Palestinians, what they say is, look, I want a job, I want to be able to travel, I want a passport, I want opportunities for my kids, and I'd really love that in Palestine. But, I'll take it in Israel too. And I think at some point, the Palestinian national movement decides to start asking for one state, binational state, which ironically could be the thing that finally jerks Israel out of this continued push towards a status quo, and a realization for most Israelis that, we have no choice here, and we have to give them a state, or the very nature of the Jewish state is going to go away. And so, but my only fear is that might be too late. It might not be possible anymore. In which case, I know where I personally come down, and I frankly, this is the first time in my life in the last couple of weeks that I've been seriously thinking about this, because it's becoming actually seeming like a reality. I come down on the side of democracy and human rights, and that's the kind of country I want Israel to be. So if that's the moment we get to, that will be my position and my view. And I sort of feel like that's where a lot of Americans will be. And that's just an impossible conundrum for Israel to deal with.
Everything has been said. I have a little to add. I do think that even the notion of this separation is quite illusory if this plan were implemented, or the unilateral aspects of it implemented. As I said, I think it's an unimplementable plan on its own. But let's say Israel tries to sort of structure it through the annexation. The odds are, I spoke to several people at the ISS conference today who said, look, that they may not have as much territory as they want, but they're there and we're here, and we won't bother each other, and that should be the end of it. And I said, I don't really think it's going to be the end of it. I think in that situation, this thing that some are calling a state, which won't really be a very functional entity, has a very high likelihood of collapse, as it already envisions a very deep penetration of Israeli security presence because of Israeli settlements on the Palestinian side of the line. But in the situation where there's a full collapse of the Palestinian Authority or the entity or the semi-state or whatever we call it, for security needs and also to provide for the needs of the population, Israel finds itself drawn back into the cities of the West Bank that it has not been in since the Oslo Accords were signed in the 1990s. That's a recipe for a much deeper intertwining, entanglement, friction between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground. That is the kind of scenario that I think is likely to add fuel to an international push for the notion of, look, everybody between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean should just be part of one entity, one person, one vote. And then Israel does face those kind of existential dilemmas of how do you keep your Jewish and democratic identity if you really in that population set don't have a stable Jewish majority, and the answer is you can't. You have to choose. So that's it's a very a real danger that trying to implement this plan or even the unilateral aspects of it could lead rather quickly down that path.
All right, well, this is Ron Klein. I want to thank our very special guests, Dan Shapiro, Tamara, Wittes, as well as Ilan, and really just a tremendous amount of good information, a lot of depth, a lot of perspective. This will evolve over the next number of days and weeks, and obviously we all hope for peace in the Middle East and security for the state of Israel, and we'll see how this plays out. But this is a very good perspective for those of us who are speaking to our friends in the community to be able to have some good information for you to talk about. Feel free. We're going to continue to put information on our website. That's www.jewishdem's.org. Use us as a resource. Please continue to support our efforts as we serve as the voice of Jewish Democrats on a whole variety of issues, Israel being one of them, but a whole lot of issues that we all care about in the United States as well. So thank you all for participating this afternoon, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.